The police, when they are interacting with people where there's possibility of the use of force, if they were honest, they would want to have that recorded. Now, we see a lot of people celebrating, especially the liberal Democrats who think that Obama is now going to save them with the National Guard. They're cheering the National Guard being deployed in Ferguson, Missouri. And of course, it looks like they're going to be coming out immediately. Now, they don't feel the same way about the National Guard being used to protect our borders by the Texas governor, by Governor Perry. And of course, there's questions in my mind as to why they took them 30 days to deploy, but they actually did deploy last Thursday. Now, the interesting thing is the reaction from the Mexican government. They are protesting the fact that we have national troops guarding our border. The Mexican Foreign Ministry protested Governor Rick Perry's deployment of National Guard troops to the southern border. And it says, according to the AP, to halt the surge of child immigrants. Of course, it's only children, you know, that are coming across. There's no adults and no drug dealers. And as we point out time and again, many of those coming across are teenage gang members of drug cartels, many adults. The children, according to the figures that have been released by the government, comprise at most about 18% of those who are coming across the border, but yet they always portray it as nothing but children. And the Mexican government says that they want to reiterate in a firm and categorical way their rejection of this measure. They say no circumstance at all or change in the border security exists that justifies this measure taken by the state. They go on to say that it doesn't contribute in any way to solving the immigration problem. I would agree with them. Probably it doesn't, because these National Guard troop soldiers cannot detain undocumented immigrants, as the AP calls them. Of course, they're illegal aliens. They say that is a federal responsibility. A federal responsibility that the federal government is not taking care of. Now, of course, over the weekend, we see Governor Perry having felony charges brought against him. And many people, even liberals, are pointing out that this is nonsense. Alan Dershowitz is saying that. We have David Axelrod saying that. If you look at the indictment, it's basically 2 counts. One of them is that he intentionally or knowingly misused government property. In other words, he didn't spend the money that was allocated for this public integrity unit. Can you believe it? This is a public integrity unit that is headed by this drunken DA who is verbally abusive. The police wanted her to be taken out. And of course, Perry threatened a veto, and that's count number 2. They say that he threatened to veto legislation. Well, that is his prerogative as governor. It's not surprising, really, that Governor Perry could have an indictment brought against him by a grand jury. Grand juries essentially do anything the district attorney wants them to do in most cases in this country. We saw just before the Ferguson riots broke out, we saw the top story the preceding week was a cop in New Jersey who said he didn't need to follow the Constitution. Well, what do the police do to honest cops who try to follow the Constitution? Well, we know about that police chief who had his entire department shut down because he got into a verbal altercation with the TSA at the airport on his way to a Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association meeting. Well, they have now taken it to another level. They have indicted him for charges that many believe are simply political payback. We have an interview with his lawyer coming up right after the break. And Alex Jones is going to have an in-depth analysis of this article from Paul Joseph Watson about the Army preparing to use lethal force against unarmed civilians. Stay with us.
Alex Jones here to tell you about how you can help spread liberty worldwide while also enjoying what I have found to be the best tasting 100% organic coffee on the planet. For more than a decade, my favorite coffee has come from the high mountains of southern Mexico, where the Chiapas farmers grow their unique shade-grown Arabica beans. We have now managed to secure these sought-after beans in a highly customized blend. Discover and try a bag of the Patriot Blend 100% organic coffee at InfoWarsLife.com. This coffee gives you a long, smooth pick-me-up for hours without the headaches and heartburn that so many other coffees give me personally. Hands down, this is my favorite coffee, and it's taken us years to secure connections directly to the Chiapas Mexican farmers. Drop by the site today, order a bag or 2, and I don't think you're going to be disappointed. Available in original or with our Immune Support Infusion Blend. You will be supporting a free press, all the while enjoying a truly great-tasting cup of my favorite coffee. Available at InfoWarsLife.com.
Well, just last week, we had a New Jersey cop caught on video when confronted by someone who believed that their First and Fourth Amendment rights were violated. He said, "I don't care about the Constitution. Obama doesn't care about the Constitution. He's not bound by it. Neither am I. We see this type of corruption in police departments all over the country now. And of course, in the past, we've had whistleblowers like Frank Serpico about the corruption based on the war on drugs. More recently in New York, we've had Adrian Schoolcraft, who blew the whistle and was testifying on the stop and search procedures of the New York Police Department. He was, for his trouble, he was picked up and arrested by the police there and put in an insane asylum until his father, a former police officer, was able to find him and get him out. That's an ongoing lawsuit going on there. Now, nowhere is this more of a problem, of course, than in Albuquerque. Albuquerque came to everyone's attention with the execution of the homeless man who was camping. And now we have an update to a story that we started covering back in February about the police chief, the entire police department of a small town taken down as this fellow was on his way to a Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association meeting, and a federal agent who threatened him that he would be fired, that his entire department would be taken out, and they were. Now, 6 months later, that officer is being charged with rape. He's been arrested, and of course, it was a staged event. The local news was told about it. They showed up. He was not given a chance to turn himself in, and there are many questions about this grand jury indictment. The primary witness against him was not there to testify, and the audio and video footage of the arrest in question was not allowed into evidence. So many times we see, especially in Albuquerque, where they have a major scandal about Taser, where the former police chief went to work for Taser, we see that even though they had one of the largest contracts for lapel cameras, they're rarely used in situations where there's questions about what happened. Now we have the opposite situation. We have a police officer who recorded the confrontation, wanting to enter that into evidence, not being allowed. So we wanted to talk to his attorney, who himself is a former police officer, who is now a civil rights attorney in Albuquerque, Tom Grover. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Grover. Now, as I was looking at this, I saw the KRQE news report. It looked to me like a clear case of character assassination, and some outright lies about the case that I had investigated, going back to when there was the altercation at the airport, the argument, and the threat that from the TSA agent or the federal agent that he would have Shane Harger fired, and subsequently that did happen. They say that that all came about when Shane Harger was trying to get past security screening with identification cards that had two different names. That's not true. I've seen the footage that was released. They cut out the footage of the actual altercation, but he went to the airport police and said, I have two IDs here, and this is the reason I have two IDs. That's how it began. It wasn't like he was trying to slip something past them. So that raised questions right there. Do you want to address that?
Well, first of all, it's an entirely separate issue to the criminal charges that my client is facing right now. But going back to the January incident, I mean, the fact is that Mr. Harger, at his own initiative, approached security to present them and disclose to them that he had his actual identity, then an alias identity relating to a witness protection program that he had been involved in. And in alerting them to that fact, it became, this sort of aggravated situation where people started posturing, and it unfolded into, a much larger, more complicated mess. But that's entirely unrelated to the situation facing Mr. Harger right now.
I know. I just brought that up because it looked to me like a clear case of them trying to make him look like a dangerous and convicting him in the eye of public opinion. They showed up at his arrest, and that in and itself is unusual, isn't it? Typically, if there's a grand jury indictment, there's an arraignment date that is set up where they have a chance to turn themselves in. Instead, they went directly out with the cameras, with the local news station, and arrested him in front of the cameras.
Oh, there's no doubt that this was a staged event. I mean, as his attorney, I didn't even know law enforcement was on their way until after they had picked him up, and I received a phone call from one of the arresting officers. The fact that, media personnel and camera personnel from all three stations were present at the police station when they brought Mr. Harger in for transportation to the detention center is a clear concerted effort to have the media present, and they were alerted by government agencies. They certainly weren't alerted by myself or Mr. Harger, and it does nothing but sort of fan the flames of ridicule and in many ways may be prejudicial to my client.
You talk about being prejudicial. In the article and in the video report, they say state police say Harger was taken into custody without any problems, as if they expected him to come out shooting or something. I mean, that's the kind of reporting that they did. They talked to a police officer, and even though they cover themselves legally by saying that this is an alleged crime, they use the term alleged, they have a quote from a police officer says, this just gives bad law enforcement a name when cops do this type of thing. So in other words, they're trying to convict him in the court of public opinion. And I guess I have a question also about the timing of this. They say that this began back in January, the investigation began back in January. To your knowledge, is that when it started?
That's my understanding. And much like Mr. Harger initiated disclosure to TSA back in January, when this allegation first came into the municipality that he's working with, he referred it. My understanding is that he referred it himself to state police for investigation. And you know, we have to put this in context, which is the state of policing in New Mexico is under tremendous scrutiny because of DOJ's impending consent decree on the state's largest police department, that being the Albuquerque Police Department. So if you're an officer, if you're a law enforcement officer, whether you're a police officer or a sheriff's deputy in the state of New Mexico, if you're accused of some sort of wrongdoing, there's not going to be any degree of latitude of discretion given to you by any of the prosecuting authorities. They're simply not going to do it because of the mismanagement and the dire condition of policing in the state because of so many things having happened and not being addressed. So that's the current climate of New Mexico policing.
Now, this incident happened back in January. When were the allegations made? Was that back in January? Did she make those allegations in January? Did she make them more recently?
I mean, let's particularize that a little bit. I mean, the alleged incident happened supposedly in January. Mr. Harger maintains his innocence, and under the eyes of the law, he's presumed to be innocent. So this alleged incident supposedly happened in January. That's correct.
Mm-hmm. And when did she come forth and say something about that? Did she do that at the time? Because it's my understanding from your statement to KRQE, you said that she was not present at the indictment, which was pretty unusual. So when did she make these allegations?
Weeks after the alleged incident is my understanding.
As a former law enforcement officer yourself, as someone who was a supervisor in the Albuquerque Police Department, how would you characterize, you talked about how there's now this current of suspicion about law enforcement in the area, and of course we've covered that many times, and we still see officers like the one who was in charge of the group that shot that homeless man. That kind of brought it into national attention. He's been subsequently promoted. I mean, what is your take on the environment there? You said that everybody's watching them very closely. What is your feeling about this?
Well, I think, you know, after so many years where questionable police misconduct hasn't received any scrutiny, we're now in a phase of the state's history where anytime there's an allegation of misconduct by the police, it's going to be heavily scrutinized. Now, any law enforcement officer in the country will agree that the second you take somebody into custody, you know, you're truly in care of that person. And when you take a person of the opposite sex in custody, there's procedures that you follow and that are taught in the academy to address that. So this is, you know, this sort of notion of a person alleging some improper action by a police officer when they've been in their control and custody is something that's, you know, succinctly aware for departments. And it's one thing when you're a large department and you have access to resources. It's another thing when you're a very small department and have very limited access to resources. So your exposure to these types of allegations increases as the size of your department decreases. And given the current state of things in New Mexico, given Mr. Harger's outspokenness in his particular county, you know, it's sort of the making of a perfect storm where, unfortunately, things aligned up where now Mr. Harger is faced with these charges. I've been involved in 3 other incidences where officers had faced the same type of charges, you know, total absence of any physical evidence and based, you know, strictly on, you know, what he said versus she said, or she said versus he said. And, this is something that the prosecution is going to have to overcome. There are issues, and unfortunately, in those cases,